The rustle of silk, the glint of a crown, the quiet whisper of a name in a gilded hall. For centuries, these were not the trappings of romance, but of ruthless, calculated deals. History is littered with marriages that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with power, land, and survival. Today, we delve into the dark heart of these unions, the ones so twisted, so utterly devoid of human kindness, that you, a modern individual, would not have survived a single day in their suffocating embrace. Before we plunge into the depths of historical despair, if the intricate tapestry of the past fascinates you, if you hunger for stories that reveal the true cost of power, then make sure you're subscribed and have hit that notification bell. Join the Quiet Historians community, and let's uncover the untold narratives together. All right, let's begin. Imagine a world where your very existence, your body, your future, your lineage was not your own. A world where your value was calculated not by your dreams or your character, but by the strength of your family's army, the vastness of their lands, or the depth of their coffers. This was the reality for countless individuals throughout history, from the lowest peasant to the loftiest monarch. And nowhere was this brutal truth more apparent than in the institution of marriage. Forget notions of soulmates or companionship. For most of history, marriage was a contract, a treaty, a transaction. It was the glue that held empires together, the foundation upon which dynasties were built, and often the iron cage in which human lives were trapped, tormented, and utterly broken. We often look back with romanticized glasses at eras of kings and queens, of grand castles and glittering courts. We imagine tales of chivalry and love, forgetting that the reality was far grimmer. Love, in the context of royal and noble marriages, was a dangerous luxury, almost an anomaly. The primary purpose was never affection. It was alliance. It was succession. It was the consolidation of power, the acquisition of territory, the silencing of rivals, or the prevention of war. A bride was a diplomatic envoy, a living treaty, a walking womb destined to produce heirs that would secure a lineage, connect two powerful families, or unite warring factions. A groom was often a foreign potentate, a necessary evil, a vehicle for power or a means to an end. And when these calculations went awry, when the human element dared to assert itself, or when the political machinations were particularly cruel, that's when these arranged unions became truly twisted. We're not talking about simply marrying someone you don't love. We're talking about forced marriages to children, to the mentally infirm, to enemies, to relatives so close that their children would be deformed, to people whose very presence invoked terror or disgust, all for reasons that had nothing to do with personal well-being. The very idea of personal happiness, self-determination, or emotional fulfillment was utterly alien to the architects of these unions. You were a pawn, a piece on a grand chessboard, and your suffering was merely collateral damage in the pursuit of power. You wouldn't survive these because your modern sensibilities, your expectation of choice, your very concept of individual rights would be utterly obliterated. The sheer psychological pressure, the physical discomfort, the lack of escape, and the omnipresent threat of political ruin or even death would be enough to break the strongest modern mind. Let's begin with perhaps the most infamous examples of arranged marriages gone catastrophically wrong, where the very act of dynastic consolidation became a genetic curse. The Habsburgs. For centuries, this royal house, whose tentacles stretched across Europe from Spain to Austria, perfected the art of strategic intermarriage. They married cousins, nieces, and uncles, not out of passion, but out of an obsessive desire to keep wealth, land, and power within the family. Their motto, "Let others wage wars." "You, happy Austria, marry," perfectly encapsulates their strategy. But this strategy came at a terrible, debilitating cost. The poster child for this genetic catastrophe was Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. Born in 1661, Charles was, by all accounts, a living testament to the dangers of inbreeding. His parents were Philip IV and Mariana of Austria, who were uncle and niece. This was not unusual for the Habsburgs. Charles's great-grandmother, Mariana of Bavaria, was also his great-aunt. The family tree was less a tree and more a tangled, impenetrable bush. The result for Charles was devastating. He could barely walk until he was 4 and couldn't speak clearly until he was 8. He suffered from a variety of ailments: rickets, an enlarged head, a constant stream of illnesses, and perhaps most famously, the Habsburg jaw, a severe prognathism that made chewing and speaking incredibly difficult, leaving his tongue so large it often drooped from his mouth. He was intellectually disabled, frail, and prone to fits. Yet he was a king, and the fate of an empire rested on his ability to produce an heir. This is where the twisted nature of his arranged marriages truly comes into horrifying focus. His entire existence was dictated by this single, impossible imperative. His first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess, married to Charles in 1679 when she was 17 and he was 18. Imagine her journey, leaving the cultured, sophisticated court of her uncle Louis XIV for the morbid, decaying Spanish court, where the king was a sickly, malformed youth. Marie-Louise was vivacious, charming, and by all accounts, beautiful. But her husband was pitiable. He was obsessed with death, often visiting the royal crypts, and his physical and mental state made any genuine intimacy or even basic communication incredibly difficult. The primary purpose of their union was, of course, to produce an heir. But Charles was almost certainly sterile, a tragic consequence of his genetic inheritance. The pressure on Marie-Louise was immense, unbearable. The Spanish court, steeped in rigid etiquette and morbid religious fervor, became her prison. Every missed menstrual cycle, every false hope of pregnancy was met with intense scrutiny and disappointment. She was ridiculed, prayed over, subjected to bizarre medical treatments and folk remedies to cure her barrenness. She starved herself, perhaps out of despair or a misguided attempt to control something in her life. After 10 childless years, Marie-Louise died mysteriously at the age of 26, possibly from appendicitis, but rumors of poisoning were rife, fueled by the desperate need for an heir. No one mourned her death for her sake. They mourned it for the lack of a successor. Then came the next victim, Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess married to Charles in 1690. She was a strong-willed, ambitious woman, hoping to exert influence in the Spanish court. But she too quickly realized the futility of her situation. Charles was even weaker than before, plagued by hallucinations and seizures. The expectation for an heir remained paramount, but the reality was just as bleak. Maria Anna faced the same pressures, the same scrutiny, the same crushing disappointment. She resorted to desperate measures, even trying to trick the court into believing she was pregnant with a false belly. Her life was a constant struggle against the inevitable, her spirit corroded by the futility of her purpose. She survived Charles, but her life was defined by the failure to fulfill the one duty she was born to perform. You, a modern individual, would never survive this. The sheer psychological burden of being a human breeding machine, knowing your body was constantly judged, scrutinized, and found wanting, would be annihilating. The lack of personal agency, the forced intimacy with a severely disabled and sickly partner, the public humiliation of your perceived barrenness, and the constant, suffocating pressure from an entire nation demanding an heir, it would be a living hell. Add to that the pervasive illness, the primitive medicine, the rigid court etiquette, and the knowledge that your failure could plunge an empire into war, and you'd likely succumb to despair, madness, or perhaps, like Marie-Louise, a mysterious ailment exacerbated by your utter misery. The Habsburg curse wasn't just physical. It was a profound spiritual and psychological torment inflicted by the twisted priorities of dynastic power. Let's shift from the inbred horror of the Habsburgs to the volatile, dangerous world of the Tudor court, where a monarch's personal whims, cloaked in divine right, could dictate life or death. No monarch exemplified this more than Henry VIII, whose 6 marriages became a brutal demonstration of absolute power and the complete subjugation of women in the pursuit of a male heir and political stability. While all of Henry's marriages were arranged to some degree, even Catherine of Aragon's, inherited from his deceased brother, 2 stand out as particularly twisted, showcasing the sheer precariousness of life when a king's desire superseded all else. First, consider Anne of Cleves, Henry's 4th wife. This was a marriage brokered entirely on political necessity. Henry, after the death of Jane Seymour, desperately needed a new queen who could provide a male heir and, crucially, secure and cour alliance with Protestant German states against the perceived threat of Catholic France and the Holy Roman Empire. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, championed the match, relying on a flattering portrait by Hans Holbein the Younger. Anne arrived in England in December 1539, a woman caught between 2 vastly different cultures. She was raised in the conservative, provincial court of Cleves, with little understanding of the sophisticated, highly politicized, and frankly, dangerous English court. She spoke no English, had no skills in music or dancing, accomplishments highly prized by Henry, and her appearance, when Henry finally met her, was, to him, a profound disappointment. The famous quote, "I like her not," uttered by Henry after their first meeting, seals her fate. He found her unattractive, her manners provincial, and her presence utterly unappealing. But the marriage treaty had been signed, the alliance forged. Henry, ever the monarch of divine right, felt trapped. He went through with the wedding on January 6, 1540, but the union was never consummated. Imagine the humiliation, the profound rejection. Anne, a foreign princess in a strange land, married to a notoriously volatile king who openly expressed his disgust. The court was rife with whispers, the political alliance teetering. Henry immediately sought an annulment, claiming the marriage was never truly binding because he had not given his inward consent. Cromwell, the architect of the match, paid the ultimate price, executed for treason. Anne, however, proved surprisingly astute, or perhaps simply fortunate. She agreed to the annulment, accepting a generous settlement, including Richmond Palace and Hever Castle, and the title of the king's beloved sister. She survived Henry, living quietly in England, a remarkable feat given the fate of so many of Henry's other wives. But her survival came at the cost of profound public humiliation, the rejection of her wifely role, and the complete invalidation of her person. She was a discarded pawn, stripped of her queenly status, her very worth as a woman called into question by the king himself. You, a modern person, would crumble under this. The public shaming, the blatant rejection by the most powerful man in the kingdom, the constant anxiety of a volatile court, knowing your life literally hung on the king's mood swings and the political winds. Even with a generous settlement, the psychological trauma of being unwanted, publicly discarded, and unable to return to your homeland for fear of being a political embarrassment would be crushing. Your worth, your identity, reduced to an unconsummated contract and a convenient political scapegoat. Even more tragically twisted was Henry's 5th wife, Catherine Howard, a young, vivacious, and perhaps naive girl, likely no older than 18 or 19, when she married the corpulent, ailing, and increasingly tyrannical Henry. who was then 49. This was less a political alliance and more a desperate attempt by Henry to reclaim his youth and virility, a fleeting burst of infatuation. Catherine was a pawn of the Howard faction, who hoped to regain influence at court after Cromwell's downfall. Catherine was ill-equipped for the pressures of her new role. She was charming and lively, but lacked the intellectual gravitas or the shrewdness of her cousin Anne Boleyn. She had a past, a history of premarital indiscretions, which, in the deeply conservative and hypocritical Tudor court, especially for a queen, were considered heinous crimes. Once queen, surrounded by flatterers, and perhaps succumbing to the loneliness and suffocating expectations of her position, she reportedly began an affair with a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, Thomas Culpeper, and promoted another former suitor, Francis Derham, to her household. The net closed quickly. Rumors escalated to accusations, evidence was gathered, and the full force of Henry's wrath descended upon her. Adultery by a queen was considered treason, as it imperiled the royal succession. Catherine was stripped of her title, confined, and ultimately executed on February 13, 1542, at the Tower of London. She was barely 20 years old. Her life was brief, her queenship a fleeting, dangerous interlude, ending in a public, gruesome death. All because she dared to exercise agency over her own body and desires in a system that demanded absolute purity and unwavering loyalty to a king who embodied the ultimate double standard. You, a modern individual, would absolutely not survive this. The extreme age gap, the immense pressure of living up to the king's unrealistic expectations, the constant surveillance, and the unforgiving moral code of the time would be suffocating. Imagine the terror of being trapped in a marriage with an increasingly paranoid, physically decaying tyrant, knowing that a single misstep, a whisper of impropriety, could lead to your horrific public execution. Your youth, your desires, your very humanity would be utterly irrelevant. You would be a sacrificial lamb on the altar of a king's ego and a family's ambition. And then there's Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, a woman scarred by her parents' tumultuous divorce and her own precarious position in the line of succession. Her marriage to Philip II of Spain, the future King of Spain and son of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was a deeply unpopular and politically charged union. Mary, a devout Catholic, saw the marriage as a means to restore Catholicism in England and to produce a Catholic heir, thereby securing the future of her faith and her kingdom. Philip, a stern and ambitious man, viewed England as a strategic outpost, a stepping stone in his vast European empire. The marriage, which took place in 1554, was met with widespread opposition in England. Parliament expressed strong disapproval, fearing England would become a Spanish satellite and that Philip would drain the country's wealth and drag it into foreign wars. Mary, however, was determined. She was already in her late 30s, desperate for an heir, and saw Philip as her only hope, both personally and politically. But the marriage was a disaster on a personal level. Philip, cold and calculating, found the older, religiously fervent Mary less appealing than her vibrant half-sister Elizabeth. He spent as little time as possible in England, often returning to Spain, leaving Mary heartbroken and isolated. The intense pressure to conceive an heir led to 2 tragic phantom pregnancies, agonizing periods of false hope for Mary, and public humiliation as her belly swelled only to deflate, revealing no child. These pregnancies were likely exacerbated by stress, ovarian cysts, or other medical issues, but in the context of the time, they were seen as divine punishment or a personal failing. Mary's reign, marked by religious persecution and unpopular foreign policies dictated by her Spanish alliance, was a period of immense suffering for her. She was consumed by her faith, her unrequited love for Philip, and her desperate need for an heir. She died childless in 1558, largely of cancer, a broken and disappointed woman, having sacrificed her personal happiness and much of her kingdom's goodwill for a marriage that ultimately failed to achieve its primary objectives. You, a modern individual, would be crushed by this. To be a queen, yet utterly alone, with your husband frequently abandoning you for political machinations and other women. To endure the immense public and personal pressure to produce an heir, only to suffer the psychological torment of phantom pregnancies, which would be interpreted as a divine curse or personal failing. To witness your nation turn against you because of your foreign spouse, and to feel the crushing weight of religious responsibility. It would be a relentless siege on your mind and body, leading to utter despair and likely an early demise from stress and heartache, if not from the medical conditions of the time. Let's now cast our gaze further east to the grand, dangerous, and often brutally autocratic courts of the Russian Tsars. Here, arranged marriages were not just about alliance and succession. They were often about absolute power, paranoia, and the suppression of any perceived dissent, particularly by the most infamous Tsar of all, Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, who reigned from 1547 to 1584, was a man consumed by paranoia, religious fervor, and bursts of extreme cruelty. His personal life reflected the chaos of his rule, especially his multiple marriages. He had at least 7 wives, some official, some unofficial, many meeting mysterious and tragic ends. His quest for a legitimate male heir was relentless, almost manic, driven by a deep-seated fear of instability and boyar conspiracies. His first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, was chosen from a bride show, a common practice for Russian Tsars, where eligible noblewomen were paraded before the monarch. She was a gentle, pious woman, and even genuinely seemed to love her. She gave him several children, including 2 sons who survived infancy. Her death in 1560 plunged Ivan into a deep depression and further fueled his paranoia, as he suspected. She had been poisoned by the boyars. Recent forensic analysis suggests she indeed suffered from mercury poisoning. After Anastasia's death, Ivan's marriages descended into a terrifying pattern of rapid succession and mysterious demises. His second wife, Maria Temrykovna, a Circassian princess, was by many accounts a manipulative and cruel woman whom Ivan tired of quickly. She died just a few years later, possibly of poisoning, or perhaps simply fading from Ivan's interest. Then came Marfa Sobakina, chosen from another bride show. She fell ill shortly after the engagement and died just 15 days after the wedding in 1571. Ivan was convinced she had been poisoned, leading to a fresh wave of executions among the boyars. This rapid succession of deaths, all under suspicious circumstances, highlights the profound danger of being close to the Tsar, especially as his consort. Each new marriage was a desperate gamble for Ivan to secure his line and, for the unfortunate woman, a gamble with her life. His fourth wife, Anna Koltovskaya, also chosen from a bride show, was sent to a convent within a year after Ivan failed. To obtain canonical permission for a fourth marriage, the Orthodox Church only permitted 3 marriages. She was lucky to escape with her life, albeit confined to a monastery. Other wives followed. Anna Vasilchikova, who also died mysteriously, or was sent to a convent. Vasilisa Melentieva, who allegedly engaged in an affair and was executed along with her lover. And finally, Maria Nagaya, whose son Dmitri also died under mysterious circumstances, sparking the time of troubles. Imagine being one of these women, paraded before a volatile, terrifying monarch, chosen for your lineage or perceived beauty, thrust into a court riddled with suspicion, intrigue, and arbitrary violence. Your primary duty is to produce a male heir for a man who suspects everyone, including his own family. Your health, your very survival, is contingent upon the whims of a Tsar who might accuse you of witchcraft or treason on a whim. The rapid turnover of wives, the convenient deaths, the exiles to convents, these were not accidents, but reflections of a deeply twisted system where the Tsar's will was absolute law, and human lives were utterly disposable. You, a modern individual, would not survive this. The sheer, relentless fear would be paralyzing. The knowledge that a misstep, a perceived slight, or merely falling out of favor could lead to a swift, brutal end would be unbearable. You would live under constant surveillance, in an atmosphere of profound paranoia, where even your closest confidants could be spies, and your own body might become the target of unseen enemies. The isolation, the lack of medical care and such, an environment, the psychological toll of being married to a man renowned for his madness and brutality, you would quickly succumb to despair, paranoia, or be removed by force, your life extinguished by the capricious nature of absolute power. The Russian court was less a home and more a death trap for many of its tsarina, designed to serve the Tsar's will until the moment they no longer did. Now, let's turn our attention to the ancient Roman Empire, a civilization that prided itself on law and order, but whose imperial courts were cesspools of political ambition, paranoia, and the ruthless use of marriage as a weapon. For elite Roman women, marriage was almost exclusively a tool for familial advancement, a means to forge alliances, solidify power, and ensure the continuation of prestigious lineages. Personal affection was secondary, if it existed at all. The stakes were incredibly high. Failure in marriage could mean political ruin, exile, or even death. Consider Julia the Elder, daughter of Emperor Augustus, a woman whose life was a tragic testament to the political manipulation of women in Rome. Born in 39 BCE, Julia was Augustus's only natural child, and thus a highly valuable political asset. Her life was a series of meticulously arranged marriages, each designed to strengthen her father's burgeoning power. Her first marriage at 14 was to her cousin Marcellus, Augustus's favored nephew and intended heir. This was a classic dynastic union, designed to cement the succession. Marcellus died just 2 years later, leaving Julia a childless widow. Her second marriage, orchestrated by Augustus, was even more brutal. She was married to Agrippa, a highly successful general and Augustus's loyal right-hand man. The catch? Agrippa was 25 years her senior, and he was already married to Julia's stepsister, Marcella the Elder. Augustus forced Agrippa to divorce Marcella to marry Julia. This union produced 5 children, 3 sons and 2 daughters, crucial for Augustus's dynastic plans. But it was not a marriage of love. Julia, a vivacious and intelligent woman, was trapped in a political alliance. Expected to be a broodmare for the empire after Agrippa's death, Augustus forced Julia into a third marriage, this time to Tiberius, his stepson and future emperor. This was perhaps the most twisted of all. Tiberius was deeply unwilling, having been forced to divorce his beloved wife, Vipsania Agrippina, for the union. He resented Julia, and their marriage was notoriously unhappy. They had 1 child who died in infancy, and after this, Tiberius eventually exiled himself from Rome, unable to bear the pretense. Julia, meanwhile, struggled under the immense pressure of being the emperor's daughter. While her father championed traditional Roman virtues and strict morality, Julia was known for her intelligence, wit, and perhaps a more liberal lifestyle that her father publicly condoned. Eventually, in 02 BCE, Augustus accused her of scandalous adultery and treason, possibly concocted charges to justify her removal from political influence or to punish her for perceived slights. He exiled her to the tiny island of Pandateria, with no male company and strict rules on who could visit her. She lived in isolation and deprivation for 5 years, then was moved to Rhegium, where she remained until her death in 14 CE, possibly. Starved to death by Tiberius upon his ascension to emperor, Julia's life was a horrifying example of how an elite Roman woman, even the emperor's daughter, was entirely devoid of personal agency. Her body was a political tool, her alliances dictated by her father, and her personal life subject to the most severe public scrutiny and arbitrary punishment. You, a modern individual, would absolutely not survive this. Imagine your entire life being a political commodity, your marriages forced upon you with no regard for your feelings, constantly being judged by an impossible standard of public morality, while men around you enjoyed impunity. The pressure to produce male heirs, the threat of exile or worse for perceived moral failings, the psychological torment of being trapped in loveless, resentful unions, and the constant fear of your powerful father turning against you. You would be isolated, stripped of dignity, and ultimately discarded when you no longer served your political purpose. The Roman imperial court was a viper's nest, and for women like Julia, even with their high status, it was a gilded cage that led to utter destruction. Now let's journey further into the heart of Central and East Asia, where powerful emperors and dynastic struggles shaped societies, and where marriage often served as a brutal instrument of control, assimilation, and the suppression of enemies. The lines between concubine and wife often blurred, and the stakes for women in these imperial courts were astronomically high, as exemplified by the Tang dynasty's Empress Wu Zetian, while Wu Zetian eventually rose to become the only female emperor of China. Her initial entry into the imperial court and her subsequent marriages were fraught with the dangers inherent in the imperial system. She entered the court as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, a relatively low rank. Upon his death, she, like all imperial concubines who had not borne sons, was sent to a Buddhist monastery. This was a common fate, a form of forced retirement, a twisted mercy compared to the outright execution that sometimes befell unwanted consorts. However, her story takes a dramatic turn. Emperor Gaozong, Taizong's son, had been captivated by Wu when he was crown prince. He brought her back to court and made her his own concubine. This was scandalous, as it was considered incestuous for a son to take his father's concubine. But Gaozong was besotted, and Wu was ambitious, intelligent, and ruthless. Her rise was meteoric, and every step involved eliminating rivals, often brutally. She displaced Empress Wang and consort Zhao, accusing them of witchcraft and having them executed, their bodies mutilated. Gaozong was weak and easily manipulated, and Wu effectively became the de facto ruler behind the scenes. Her marriage to Gaozong, initially a concubine-emperor relationship, evolved into one where she wielded immense power, culminating in her becoming empress. But her life was a constant battle for survival and supremacy. She bore sons for Gaozong, but even they were not safe from her ambition. She allegedly murdered her own infant daughter to frame Empress Wang and consolidate her power. While not an arranged marriage in the traditional sense of being forced upon her, her entire existence was defined by the imperial marriage system and the ruthless power plays it entailed. She secured her position through a series of calculated alliances and eliminations, with her marriage to Gaozong serving as the primary vehicle for her ascension. The twisted aspect here isn't just the brutality she inflicted, but the brutality she faced within the system itself. To survive and rise, she had to become as ruthless as the system that sought to contain her. Her life was a testament to the fact that even the most powerful women in these courts lived in a constant state of high-stakes political warfare, where one wrong move, one lost favor, could mean not just personal ruin, but the annihilation of one's entire family. Her marriage was less a partnership and more a battlefield for ultimate control, where alliances were temporary and betrayal was rampant. Beyond Empress Wu, Consider the broader practice of political marriages in Chinese and Japanese dynasties, especially those involving peace brides or hostage brides. Young princesses or noblewomen were routinely sent to marry foreign rulers or rival clan leaders. These women often left their homes never to return, serving as living guarantors of peace treaties, vulnerable to the whims of their new lords and foreign courts. Their loyalty was constantly under suspicion, their primary duty to assimilate, and produce heirs that would dilute their original lineage's claim. If peace broke, they could be executed or discarded. You, a modern individual, would not survive this. The sheer isolation, the cultural shock, the constant pressure to conform to entirely new customs and languages, and the immense burden of being a living political pawn would be overwhelming. The knowledge that your family's safety, or even the peace between nations, rested entirely on your behavior and your ability to produce an heir, would be a crushing weight. The constant threat of being deposed, imprisoned, or executed by a powerful emperor or a jealous rival, or simply falling out of favor, would create an environment of perpetual fear. The lack of personal freedom, the strict court etiquette, and the knowledge that your life was utterly disposable in the grand scheme of dynastic power would drive any modern mind to madness. Let's descend into the medieval period of Europe, a time of feudal lords, warring factions, and a church that, while powerful, often struggled to impose its will on ambitious nobles. Here, arranged marriages were the very bedrock of the social and political order. They were the means by which land was consolidated, alliances were forged, and potential enemies were bound. And often, these marriages were nothing short of brutal. Of the most common and profoundly twisted forms of arranged marriage in medieval Europe was the child marriage. Girls, sometimes as young as 7 or 8, and boys barely older, were betrothed, often against their will or without their comprehension, to solidify treaties, inheritances, or political connections. The idea was to ensure the future of the lineage and the stability of alliances. These child brides were then sent off, often great distances, to live in the households of their future in-laws, essentially as hostages or wards raised to fulfill their future roles. Consider the case of Blanche of Castile. While she became a highly successful and powerful queen regent of France, her early life exemplifies the cold reality of child marriages. Born in 1188, she was the daughter of Alfonso VIII of Castile and Eleanor of England, daughter of Henry II. At just 12 years old, in 1200, she was married to Prince Louis, the future Louis VIII of France, who was 13. This marriage was part of the Treaty of La Goulette, a peace agreement between her uncle, King John of England, and King Philip II of France, settling various territorial disputes. Blanche was the living embodiment of this treaty. Imagine being a 12-year-old girl, ripped from your home and family, sent across a continent to marry a boy you've never met and expected immediately to assume the duties of a princess, including the crucial one of producing an heir. While Blanche eventually found her footing and thrived, many child brides did not. They faced immense pressure to conceive, often before their bodies were physically mature. They were frequently married to much older men, sometimes abusive, sometimes already infirm, and were expected to manage vast households, estates, and political intrigues, all while still essentially children themselves. There was no concept of consent, no protection from abuse, no escape from the contract. Their childhood was stolen, their bodies repurposed for dynastic survival. Even powerful figures like Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the wealthiest and most influential women of the Middle Ages, found their marriages dictated by political necessity, and even she, with all her formidable intellect and power, was not immune to the cruelty of the system. She first married Louis, the 7th of France in 1137. This was a match of immense strategic importance, uniting her vast duchy of Aquitaine with the French crown. However, Their personalities clashed dramatically. Louis was pious and ascetic. Eleanor was worldly, vivacious, and politically ambitious. They had produced 2 daughters, but no male heir. The pressure to produce a son for the French throne was immense, and after 15 years, their marriage was annulled on grounds of consanguinity. They were distantly related, a convenient excuse for a union that had become politically and personally untenable due to the lack of a male heir. Immediately after the annulment, Eleanor, still immensely wealthy and desirable, married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. This was a power move that infuriated Louis VII and fundamentally reshaped the political map of Europe, leading to centuries of conflict between England and France. While their early years together might have been passionate, this marriage too dissolved into bitter rivalry and eventually open warfare, primarily over the control of their sons and Eleanor's vast territories. Henry imprisoned Eleanor for many years, effectively erasing her as a political force, a testament to even her immense power being ultimately subservient to male authority. You, a modern individual, would never survive this. The thought of being married as a child, forced into an adult role, with no say in your destiny, would be profoundly traumatizing. The physical risks of early childbirth in an era without modern medicine were immense, often leading to death. The constant threat of disease, famine, and warfare would compound the insecurity. Imagine the emotional desolation of being sent to a foreign land entirely isolated, expected to perform duties far beyond your years, and living under the constant threat of your marriage being annulled for political reasons, or worse, being imprisoned by your own husband because you dared to assert your will. The medieval world was brutal, and for the individuals caught in its marital web, it was a terrifying and often fatal trap. Now, let's turn to a fascinating and often misunderstood corner of history, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman court, particularly. The imperial harem was a world unto itself, a complex ecosystem of power, intrigue, and rigid hierarchy. While the sultans did not typically take empresses in the European sense, their system of concubinage and strategic marriages for their daughters created a unique and often twisted set of marital dynamics that the Ottoman sultans, unlike their European counterparts, generally did not marry foreign princesses in formal, monogamous unions to produce heirs. Instead, the heir to the throne was born to a concubine within the imperial harem. This system was designed to prevent foreign powers from gaining influence through marriage alliances and to ensure that the sultan's children were solely products of his own lineage, untainted by rival dynastic claims. However, within this system, women could still rise to immense power, and their lives were often fraught with peril. Take Hurrem Sultan, known in the West as Roxolana. Originally a Ruthenian slave girl, captured and brought to the imperial harem, she broke all the rules. She captivated Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, became his favorite, bore him many children, and crucially, convinced him to do something unprecedented, to formally marry her. This was revolutionary, elevating her from mere concubine to the legal wife of the Sultan, a position no other concubine had ever achieved. Her marriage to Suleiman was born of love, yes, but it was forged within the profoundly dangerous and competitive environment of the harem. Hurrem's life, despite her love match and power, was intensely twisted by the system. She constantly battled rival concubines, especially Mahidevran, the mother of Suleiman's eldest son, Mustafa. The fight for influence and the succession of her own sons was a brutal, no-holds-barred war. Hurrem was instrumental in the downfall and execution of Mustafa, ensuring that her own son, Selim, would inherit the throne. She navigated a labyrinth of intrigue, assassinations, and power plays, always on guard, always calculating. Her position, though immensely powerful, was never truly secure. A slight misstep, a loss of favor, could have meant her demise or the death of her children. Beyond the Sultan's consorts, the arranged marriages of Ottoman princesses, sultanas, were equally illustrative of the system's twisted nature. Sultanas were often married to powerful viziers, generals, or provincial governors. These marriages were not about love, but about solidifying political alliances, rewarding loyal servants, and keeping powerful men tied to the imperial family. These unions often conferred immense prestige upon the groom, but they came with significant strings. The sultanas often retained considerable independence and wealth, and their husbands were expected to be utterly devoted and subservient to their imperial wives. A husband who displeased his sultana could face severe consequences, including dismissal or even execution. The sultanas themselves, though seemingly powerful, were still pawns in the larger imperial game, their personal lives dictated by the needs of the dynasty. Many of these marriages were unhappy, with the sultanas exerting their authority over reluctant husbands. You, a modern individual, would never survive this. The harem, while often romanticized, was a gilded cage. For a concubine, the ruthless competition for the sultan's attention, knowing that only a successful pregnancy could elevate your status, and that even then your child might be murdered by rivals, would be terrifying. For a sultana, the burden of being an imperial symbol, married off to men who were essentially subservient to you, yet could still be dangerous, and the constant political maneuvering to protect your own interests would be exhausting. The lack of freedom, the constant surveillance, the ever-present threat of poison or assassination, in a court where power was absolute and loyalty fleeting, would be enough to break any modern spirit. Your life would be a series of strategic maneuvers, your personal happiness irrelevant, your survival dependent on your cunning and the capricious favor of the Sultan. Finally, let's briefly consider a marriage that, while not involving royalty, perfectly encapsulates the sheer, unadulterated cruelty that could be inflicted through arranged unions, when the goal was simply control and the suppression of an individual. This isn't a grand historical event, but a microcosm of untold suffering that occurred countless times across centuries and continents. This is the story of a young woman, perhaps named something like Elara, forced to marry a significantly older, often abusive, and sometimes mentally unstable man for land, debt, or a family's social standing. Imagine Elara, a girl of perhaps 15, living in a small provincial village in medieval Europe, or even early modern Europe. Her family, perhaps a minor noble house, or even wealthy peasants, has fallen on hard times. A neighboring lord, known for his cruelty, his advanced age, and perhaps his foul temper and physical deformities, makes an offer. He wants land, or he wants to cancel a debt owed by Elara's father, or he simply desires a young, fresh wife, a trophy to assert his power. The father, desperate to save his family from ruin or to rise in status, agrees. Elara is given no choice. Her tears, her pleas, her terror are ignored. She is dressed in her wedding finest, a cruel mockery of joy, and sent to a grim, isolated castle or manor, far from everything she knows. Her new husband is a stranger, physically repulsive, demanding, and utterly without kindness. He sees her, not as a person, but as property, a vessel to produce an heir, or merely a servant to satisfy his desires. Her life becomes a living nightmare. She is isolated, without friends or family to turn to. Her days are filled with relentless domestic duties, managing a household that is often neglected or impoverished. Her nights are filled with dread, subjected to the unwanted advances of her husband, with no concept of consent or bodily autonomy. She quickly learns that any resistance, any sign of unhappiness, will be met with violence, psychological abuse, or further isolation. If she becomes pregnant, the physical toll of childbirth in an era without modern medicine is immense, often Fatal. If she fails to produce a male heir, the pressure, the accusations, the disdain become even more intense. She sees no escape. Divorce is impossible. Running away means destitution, shame, and often a worse fate. There is no law to protect her, no societal mechanism to intervene. Her suffering is her private burden, accepted as the natural order of things. She watches her youth fade, her spirit break, her dreams wither and die, all for a transaction that saved her family from one kind of ruin, only to plunge her into another. She lives a life of quiet desperation, fear, and profound loneliness, constantly subjected to the whims of a man who owns her. You, a modern individual, would not survive. This, your concepts of human rights, bodily autonomy, and personal dignity would be utterly violated. The constant physical and psychological abuse, the complete lack of control over your own life, the profound isolation, and the absence of any legal or social recourse would be crushing. The inability to escape, to simply walk away, would lead to profound despair, depression, or even madness. Your expectations of emotional connection, mutual respect, and basic kindness would be so utterly unmet that the sheer bleakness of your existence would be unbearable. This kind of arranged marriage, stripped of the royal pomp, but full of raw human misery, was perhaps the most common and devastating form of twisted union throughout history, and it is precisely why you would never survive it. As we conclude this dark journey through history's most twisted arranged marriages, a few stark truths emerge, truths that underscore precisely why you, a modern individual, imbued with the values of self-determination and personal freedom, would simply never survive them. The single most pervasive and soul-crushing theme is the absolute lack of agency. You would be a commodity, your body and future entirely external to your own will. From the moment of your birth, your worth would be assessed not by who you are, but by what you represent: an alliance, a bloodline, a piece of property, a political pawn. The very idea of choosing your partner, or even having a say in your own life, would be a fantastical absurdity. Your desires, your dreams, your emotional needs would be utterly irrelevant. You would be moved, sold, or bartered like chattel. Your humanity utterly disregarded. This fundamental violation of self, repeated daily, would be an unbearable psychological burden. Then there is the body as a political tool. For women especially, your womb would be your primary value. The relentless pressure to produce heirs, particularly male heirs, would be constant and terrifying. Phantom pregnancies, miscarriages, stillbirths, or infertility would be met not with sympathy, but with suspicion, public humiliation, or even accusations of witchcraft or divine disfavor. Your physical well-being would be secondary to your reproductive function. The dangers of childbirth, the lack of medical care, and the societal condemnation for failure would turn your own biology into a source of immense anxiety and potential doom. For men, your body would be a tool for conquest and alliance, your virility tied to your family's future, your personal preferences discarded for political expediency. Consider the profound isolation and loneliness. Despite grand courts or bustling households, many of these individuals lived lives of immense personal solitude. Trapped in a foreign land, surrounded by strangers or political enemies, with no one to trust and no one who truly cared for their personal well-being. The mental toll would be immense. Affection was a luxury, genuine companionship a rarity. Your marriage was a professional arrangement, devoid of emotional intimacy, leaving you profoundly alone in your suffering. The omnipresent threat of physical and psychological abuse would be another inescapable reality, whether through direct violence from an older, cruel, or mentally unstable spouse, or the more subtle but equally corrosive abuse of constant scrutiny, public humiliation, and the denial of your basic human needs, these unions were often sites of profound suffering. There was no concept of domestic violence laws, no shelters, no easy escape. Your tormentor was often the most powerful person in your life, with legal and societal sanction to inflict whatever he pleased. And finally, the constant threat of failure, both personal and political, would hang over your head like a sword of Damocles. Failure to produce an heir, failure to maintain an alliance, falling out of favor with a capricious monarch, or merely being perceived as weak or inconvenient. Any of these could lead to divorce, imprisonment, exile, or a swift, brutal execution. Your existence would be a tightrope walk with no safety net, under the constant gaze of a demanding court or society. In essence, your modern expectation of a life lived with choice, dignity, autonomy, and the pursuit of happiness would be utterly incompatible with the brutal realities of these historical arranged marriages. Your very spirit would be broken by the relentless pressure, the lack of freedom, the profound insecurity, and the constant fear. You would not survive them, not because you are weak, but because you are human, and these unions were designed for anything but humanity. They were instruments of power, and the individuals caught within them were merely the sacrificial lambs on the altar of dynastic ambition. The past, in this regard, serves as a stark reminder of the immense value of the freedoms we often take for granted today.